Empathy. It's a necessary part of life. We need it to be able to understand each other. But what happens when it goes too far? Not on a personal level, but on a societal level. In his new book, Suicidal Empathy, Dr. Gad Saad says that we've already gone too far. Hello and welcome to the Full Comment Podcast. I'm Brian Lilly, your host, and today we explore suicidal empathy with Dr. Saad, an academic who has applied evolutionary psychology to issues such as marketing and consumer behavior. In the past, he studied things such as why men buy fast cars and what drives consumer behavior. His work in the past few years, such as his book, The Parasitic Mind, has looked at wider societal issues and why we are facing decline. After years of living in Montreal as a professor at Concordia University, he recently announced that he was joining the University of Mississippi, where he will serve as a scholar at the university's Declaration of Independence Center for the Study of American Freedom. I reached Dr. Saad at his home in Montreal. So, Professor Saad, Gad, what is suicidal empathy? Define it for me. I mean, empathy, we all need to be empathetic towards other people, but how do you get to suicidal empathy?
Right. Well, first, so good to be with you again, Brian. Thank you for having me on. Empathy, as you said, is a evolutionarily selected virtue. We are a social species with a big prefrontal cortex, so it makes perfect evolutionary sense that we evolve the capacity to empathize. For you and I to have a meaningful conversation, I need to put myself in your mind and vice versa. That's called cognitive empathy or theory of mind. We want our spouses to be empathetic, our best friends, our veterinarians, our therapists, our physicians. So there is nothing wrong with well-calibrated empathy. But as Aristotle explained to us several thousand years ago via his theory of the golden mean, too little of something is not good, too much of something is not good, and much of life is about finding that sweet spot. And that exactly applies to empathy. If I have no empathy, I'm likely to be a psychopath. If I have too much empathy, so if it hyperfires in the wrong situations towards the wrong targets of my empathy, I end up with suicidal empathy.
And really, in the book, you're talking about this on a civilizational scale, that Western civilization specifically is putting itself on a path to extinguishing itself in some ways by being too open, too empathetic, too filled with too much kindness and understanding.
Exactly. So Arnold Toynbee is a famed British historian who, I mean, he's no longer with us, but his probably most famous work was a 12-volume set where he did an analysis of civilizations and their trajectories and how they eventually get extinguished. And the maxim that comes out of this mammoth historical study was that, quote, civilizations do not die by murder, they die by suicide. And so what I'm doing in the book is I'm saying, yes, he's exactly right. And in the current zeitgeist, the way we are committing suicide is via suicidal empathy. And here I'd like to introduce another term that I've coined in the book, civilizational seppuku. Seppuku is a ancient Japanese suicide ritual, which these types of rituals occur in cultures of honor and shame, where the worst thing that could happen to you is for you to lose face and to lose honor. So in the samurai class, if you had engaged in an action that brought you or your group, your samurai cohorts, great shame, the only way to expiate this shameful reality would be to commit seppuku, which is you commit self-disembowelment. And that hopefully is a small measure to you getting redemption and penance for your shameful acts. Well, that's what we're doing in the West. We're committing civilizational seppuku via suicidal empathy. Now, here the question would then be, but why? What are you committing civilizational seppuku for? Well, if I internalize the message that we are an irredeemably evil society that is built on stolen land, that has committed genocide, that is built on slavery, that's transphobic, that's Islamophobic, that is patriarchal and misogynistic, and therefore I am inherently existentially evil as a Western person, then the only way to resolve this problem is to commit civilizational seppuku.
It does seem like many in our society like to sit in the town square wearing a hair shirt, talking about how awful we are. Um, how did we get to this point where we used to all talk about you know you and I are sitting in Canada right now. You're in Montreal. I'm in Toronto. Uh, we grew up with politicians, with leaders, with community pillars who would say, "Oh, we live in the greatest country on earth." And now we're the best hotel on earth and a multicultural society that is still racist and xenophobic and not welcoming enough, despite welcoming everyone from around the world. And by the way, as you said, genocide and stolen land. How did we get here? Because some of this was in the academic world years ago.
Yeah.
And, I remember seeing it at places like McMaster University, or when I moved to Montreal, Concordia, where you have taught for many years. And you think, well, this is just crazy. But it morphed, it grew. It was like the blob that kept getting bigger.
Yes. So your question is actually a nice prompt to explain how Suicidal Empathy, my current book, is linked to one of my previous books, The Parasitic Mind, because it's going to answer your question. We are both a thinking and a feeling species. It's raw. The old tension between reason and emotion is actually a false and a moot dichotomy. In many cases, having our affective system invoked makes perfect evolutionary sense. If I'm walking down a dark alley to take a shortcut to get home, and I notice that there are these young men loitering around in the dark alley, I will get an emotional and affective response that makes perfect evolutionary sense. My blood pressure will go up, my breathing will become more shallow, my heart will race more, and that makes perfect evolutionary sense. So it's not that we are a thinking or feeling animal, we're both. The issue is to know when to invoke which. Now, why am I saying all this? In order for me to completely hijack your capacity to reason and to be wedded and tethered to reality, I need to do two things. I need to parasitize your cognitive system, your thought processes, and I also need to parasitize your emotional system. The Parasitic Mind, my previous book, talked about how do we parasitize our cognitive system, and Suicidal Empathy talks about the affective system. Now, why am I saying all this? Because all of the ideas that led to us merrily swimming in the infinity pool of suicidal empathy come from academia. You said some of those ideas, I think you maybe used the qualifier. No, not some. Every single parasitic idea that I discuss in the Parasitic Mind that then opened the doors for suicidal empathy come from academia. What are these? Postmodernism, cultural relativism, social constructivism, identity politics, biophobia, the fear of using biology to explain human affairs, radical feminism. All of these ideas slowly but surely were, knocking on the edifices of reason to try to bring them down. And then once you had enough inertia with all of these parasitic ideas festering and then breaking out of the metaphorical lab, it starts off in the humanities departments and in the social sciences, but then it becomes a walking manifestation of these parasitic ideas called Justin Trudeau, because he was imbibed with all of this nonsense. So it's not surprising that when he then becomes prime minister, he creates a feminist foreign policy. He talks about she-cession instead of recession. He talks about she-covery rather than economic recovery. So that's how we got to where we are. We took these dreadful ideas, every single one of which was spawned on university campuses, not just at Concordia, but also at Harvard and my alma mater of Cornell. And then those folks that were trained in that nonsense become our journalists, our filmmakers, our cultural shapers, our politicians. And voila, here we are.
And we end up with, as you said, Justin Trudeau as prime minister, and we do a gender-based analysis plus lens applied to issues like defense and what kind of assistance we're going to give to Ukraine to fight their war against Russia. We sent gender-based analysis people to do gender-based analysis to Ukraine. I don't know how that helps them with the drones, but that's how far this parasitic mind and this suicidal empathy have extended themselves within Canada. You mentioned biology, and I know earlier in your career throughout your career, but earlier in your career, you did studies like, why do men buy fast cars and things like that, and what it does. So I'm thinking of the Jaguar ad suddenly, the one that took a car brand that was iconic, that men bought so that they would get a hot date or to impress a woman, and they made it androgynous. They didn't show the car. There were no men. There were no women. There was nothing. I mean, how do you go from, yes, hot cars get hot women to nothing really exists?
Right. A beautiful question. And I actually addressed this in Suicidal Empathy, specifically the example of the Jaguar campaign, which beautifully retorted by Elon Musk, where he said, "Hey, Jaguar, do you still sell cars?" or something to that effect, because he was exactly speaking to your point. So let me here, if you don't mind for a second, put on my business school professorial hat and explain the evolution of how we got to Jaguar. So in this past, say, 100 years of the relationship between the firm and the consumer, we've had, I argue, 4 stages. The first stage, 100 plus years ago, it was called a production-centric stage, meaning that my responsibility as a corporation was to meet consumer demands for the product. Now, how is that captured best? By the famous adage of Henry Ford, where he said, the consumer can have the car in any color that he or she wishes, as long as it's black. Meaning that he doesn't care about your consumer preference. His responsibility is that there is a demand for cars. He's going to have a production line that meets those demands. The next stage, stage 2, came along and said, no. We also have to take into account consumer heterogeneity of preferences. Brian likes his car blue. Gad likes his car black, and therefore we need to be a marketing-centric production unit. And therefore now we're incorporating consumer preferences. Stage 3 came along, say, by about the 70s, where yes, we have to meet consumer demands, so we have to be production-centric. We have to do so while ensuring that we recognize that there is consumer heterogeneity of preferences, but we also have to do those 2 things while not harming any third party, like the environment. So now we come to the green movement, be kind to the environment through your production process. And then the 4th stage that leads us to the Jaguar campaign is, no, that's not enough. We need to do stages 1, 2, and 3, but we also have to be proactive in combating social justice issues wherever we can uncover them. So my job as Jaguar is no longer the fiduciary responsibility to maximize short-term profits for the shareholders. That's old stuff. I now have to be proactive in recognizing that there is trans invisibility, and by then putting them in the ad campaign, I'm actually doing the most important thing that I can do, which is fight social justice issues.
So back to Elon Musk's question, do you still sell cars?
but
I don't think they do anymore. They plummeted after that.
They would answer, Brian, if I can put myself in the wokesters who came up with that ad campaign. That's a dumb question. That's an antiquated view of what businesses should be doing. I don't have to be selling cars, because that is secondary to the most important mission statement of a truly enlightened company, and that is to fight injustice. So I will not answer your idiotic question. We do a lot more than just sell cars.
It's a society, it's not just in Canada, it's not just in the United States. Throughout Europe, issues such as immigration and assimilation have become massive. In some ways, the fact that you are planning on leaving Canada is in part because how we have failed to assimilate, how we have failed to bring people along or bring in the right people, whichever view you want to have. You are facing an awful lot of anti-Semitism. How does our tolerance, our desire to be open, to be empathetic work into how our society is not functioning properly now in terms of assimilating new cultures?
Yes, a great question. So, of all of the endless cases of suicidal empathy that I discuss in the book. So, trans activism is a form of suicidal empathy. The notion of forbidden knowledge is an example of suicidal empathy. Soft on crime policies is an example of suicidal empathy. How we deal with the homelessness crisis is a manifestation of suicidal empathy. Of all of those manifestations that I cover extensively in the book, none is more civilizationally ending than the open border immigration policy, which is the ultimate form of suicidal empathy. And let me explain why. The old adage that demography is destiny couldn't be more apt, right? What makes Canada Canada or the US is not just that there's this thing called the Rocky Mountains or that there are these beautiful lakes, on the shores, Lake Ontario. What makes Canada Canada, old Canada, the one that you and I knew, is that there were a set of Canadian values that were clearly distinct from Waziristan values, then Afghani values. That doesn't mean that human beings don't share a common ancestry in terms of a shared biological heritage, but cultures exist as distinct units precisely because while they may share many features, they also don't share many other important features. Okay, so having said that, let's now take one of the parasitic ideas from the parasitic mind that I discuss, and then demonstrate how the downstream effects of that leads to open border policies. Cultural relativism is the notion that it is inappropriate for us, and by us I mean Western people, Canada, US, whomever it is, to judge the cultural values and practices of another society. If another society decides that it is perfectly reasonable to cut off the clitorises of 5-year-old girls because that's their religious imperative to do so, shut up, racist. If they wish to stone women, if they dishonor them, shut up, racist. If they have child brides, that's how they organize their mating system, shut up, racist. Well, if I internalize that idea pathogen called cultural relativism, it then renders me impotent to ever say things like, wait a minute, we can't have as many people coming from Waziristan as those coming from Denmark, because that feels icky, that feels gauche, that feels racist. All immigrants deserve the right to, live out their life, fully in Canada. A year ago, I was invited to speak in Iceland. And Iceland is bathing in suicidal empathy. In Reykjavik, you thought that maybe you were in Gaza because there was free Palestine, Hamas everywhere. And I warned, I did several media, I did a media tour, I answered questions, they wrote articles about me, and I warned them a year ago what was going to happen. Well, I just received a private DM, although he did also post the sentiments publicly, from my host in Reykjavik, who said, oops, everything that you said and predicted would come true. We've now seen it a year later. So when I stood, Brian, 25 years ago, screaming from top of the mountains into the wilderness, saying, Canada, you're going to regret your largesse. Well, now people write to me privately and say, oops, I guess you were right. So this is why I'm leaving now, because it doesn't take much for you to predict that if you let in millions of people into a host society, and those people typically come from societies that have endemic Jew hatred as their definitional feature. I mean, literally, there are nonpartisan surveys that have been done from those societies where of all of the polled people, 95 to 99% exhibit really problematic views of the Jews. Then do you need the fancy professor to tell you that you're going to have an increase in Jew hatred in Canada? It's unbelievable, Brian.
We need to take a break, but first, don't forget, we've got merch. That's right. You want to sport a nice hoodie that says National Post, maybe a dad ball cap that says Toronto Sun on it? Well, from hoodies to hats to tote bags, mugs, and more, well, you can now shop the official gear of Post Media, National Post, Toronto Sun, your favorite local Post Media paper. It's a bold way to show your love for fearless journalism, and it looks good too. Visit postmedia.store. That's postmedia.store to shop the collection today.
This is Tristan Hopper, the host of Canada Did What?, where we unpack the biggest, weirdest, and wildest political moments in Canadian history you thought you knew and tell you what really happened. Stick around at the end of the episode to hear a sample of one of our favorite episodes from Season 2. And if you missed it, there are even more episodes from last season, so make sure you subscribe to Canada Did What? Everywhere you get podcasts.
I remember back to when the Harper government was in power, and they stated clearly that they believed that as we bring new immigrants into the country, that we need to assimilate them and they need to adopt Canadian values. And the response from the progressive side of the political spectrum was, that's racist. That's awful. But what were they talking about? Respect for men and women, ending barbaric cultural practices like cutting off of clitorises, respect for the rule of law and democracy, respect for each other. I know, people from all parts of the world who absolutely embody that, but that's because they chose to. We don't preach that anymore, and we say, "Come to Canada, we're a great country," and then we bring people in, and they say, "But whatever you're doing is just fine or better." And so, instead of telling people to, as Mark Carney recently did, I'm not sure he believes it, but he said, when you come to Canada, leave your old hatreds and fights at home. We encourage people to hang on to that. My parents came here, they did not want to carry the sectarian troubles of Glasgow and Northern Ireland into Canada with them, and they did not. Some people want to continue that. Look at the whole Khalistani movement. An Indian separatist movement has more support in Canada, which engenders violence in both Canada and India, and it has more support here than in India. And we tolerate it.
Indeed. Although regarding Mark Carney, from this side of his mouth, he said what you mentioned. From this side of his mouth, he said that Islamic values are Canadian values. So, I'm not sure how much I place a lot of weight onto anything that he says. Now, regarding your earlier point about Harper and, barbaric practices and so on, you might remember the substitute drama teacher, Justin Trudeau. At the time, he was a MP. And I don't know if you remember how he flipped his hair and really put on the full thespian power of his drama training, where he exhibited just revulsion. I mean, he had a visceral reaction that you would be describing those practices as barbaric. He wasn't concerned about the barbaric practices. He was concerned that the Harper government called them barbaric. That is exactly what happens when you have all of the internalized parasitic ideas defining your personhood. Look, I hate to say this, Brian, because I always want to leave the viewers and listeners to feel empowered and optimistic. I'm not sure that Canada will recover. Now, a lot of imbeciles will listen to this thing and say, what are you talking about? I live in a gorgeous neighborhood in Toronto and Moncton and Chilliwack and, on the Cabot Trail. What is this idiot professor talking about? Well, it's because they don't have the courage and the vision to extrapolate from current trends to future trends, right? That's what makes someone seem as though they're being prophetic. They're not being prophetic. They're just reading the writing on the wall. So all of the things that I have predicted and have come out true, it's not because I have a direct line to God that allows me to see the things that other people don't see. It's because my eyes are wide open. So right now, I've repeatedly said that there are very few countries that have entered the pantheon of the very laudable elite status stage 5 suicidal empathy. That's even higher than the most highest form of stage 4 suicidal empathy. Well, I regrettably and with great chagrin tell you that Canada is stage 5 suicidal empathy. Britain is stage 5 suicidal empathy. Now, I want to leave this answer with some positivity. there is some optimism, namely that there is an actual set of autocorrective policies that we could implement to reverse the ship. So that's the optimistic part.
And I want to get to the end of your book. You talk about how to inoculate yourself. But before that, I do want to ask, so many people have said, oh, Trump got elected and woke is over everywhere. And you address that in the book and say, no.
Absolutely not. So let me just finish the other point and I'll address that one and then we'll talk about the inoculation. The bad part is the positive part is that there is a solution. The negative part is that I see no evidence that the West has remotely the testicular fortitude to implement 1 millimeter of the autocorrective policies. If anything, they're doubling and tripling down on the bad stuff. Regarding Trump eradicating all the woke stuff, exactly as you said correctly, I right away killed that canard because people think, well, hey, Trump came along, he signed an executive order ending, trans competition in female sports and the NCAA. The problem is gone. No, he's just a doorstop. For you to truly eradicate all of these parasitic ideas that have led to suicidal empathy, the ideas themselves have to become vanquished. Now, most of the parasitic ideas, well, all of the parasitic ideas that I talk about in my books, they took about 50 to 100 years to fully be spawned and flourish in academia and then break out of academia. I'd like to think that it won't take 50 to 100 years to vanquish them. I'm not sure we have the luxury of that much time, but it's not going to start and end with Trump, to your point.
So let's talk about some of the ways in your book that you say we can inoculate ourselves. Do not succumb to the false equality bias.
Okay, let's do that one.
Yeah, give me a quick answer on what that is.
Okay, so all immigrants are equally likely to assimilate. I'm imposing a false equality to a place where that's simply not true. All other things equal, notwithstanding that there are millions of Muslims that are perfectly lovely and kind, just like that's true in any other grouping. There are mean Jews and nice Jews. There are Jewish pedophiles and Jews who fight against pedophilia. So we're not talking about individual people, but if you bring in people from Islamic societies, can we predict whether the host society will yield an increase or a decrease in Jew hatred? We know the answer to that.
You are from Lebanon. Now, originally, you came in the 70s when Lebanon was much different. But bringing in you is very different than bringing in a hardcore supporter of Hezbollah and saying, integrate into Canada.
But the suicidally empathetic don't go by that premise because they'd like to impose that false equality. They'll say to me, one of the most common attacks that I get is, you are such a hypocrite, Gad Saad. You're an immigrant. Your buddy Elon Musk is an immigrant. Why do you rail against immigration? Well, that has about as much intelligence as the following analogy. Ready? Fido the cat is a feline. The wild lion in the African savanna is a feline. They're both called feline. That's why I think that I am equally likely to cuddle successfully with either. So that's why when I go to Tanzania on my rodeo safari thing, as soon as I see a pride of lions, I will merrily jump out of the Jeep so I can cuddle them, because look, they're called felines, just like my cat Fido is called feline. So I'm an immigrant who has spent his career fighting for actual real Canadian values and American values. That's why the Canadian, yours truly, is going to be the distinguished professor at the Declaration of Independence Center for the Study of American Freedom. I'm not American, and yet I embody those American principles. So I'm an immigrant who is fully aligned with the host societies that have generously allowed me to come in. Ahmed Muhammad Hussein is also an immigrant who just returned from a summer camp with Al-Qaeda in Waziristan. We're not equally likely to contribute meaningfully to Canadian society.
You are going to have to contribute to Canadian society even as you leave. You've been writing about this. Tell us a little bit about that before we part ways here. You're absolutely despondent at how much your accountant told you you'll have to pay in an exit tax to leave the country. You don't have to give a dollar figure, but can you give a percentage or, give us a sense?
I thought we were friends. Asking me that question will forevermore create anger in my heart towards you because nothing, I'm not being hyperbolic. I went through the Lebanese civil war and faced imminent execution. My parents were kidnapped and tortured by Fatah. That was less painful to me existentially than how I've been treated by the parasitic taxation in Canada. Why? Because notwithstanding that everybody hates taxes, there is something uniquely painful about taxes taking the labor, the fruits of my mind, right? So when I already pay huge taxes on my professorial salary, but if I now go out and write a book of which that most of the royalties of that book, I mean, literally 99% of the royalties do not come from Canada. Canada says, hey, 58% of your personhood, asshole, belongs to me, right? Because remember, at the highest progressive tax, the highest federal tax rate is 33%. The highest Quebec tax rate is 25.75%. Add those up and then add all of the other taxes, at the end of which you're left probably with about 30 cents to the dollar. Or as I like to also explain, roughly from January 1st to end of August, I work free for the government. And then starting in September, you allow me to keep my book royalty proceeds. Okay, fine. That's good. I've accepted that. That happened a few years ago. I walked around like a rape victim in complete stupor for months, but then
This
that's
was
great.
after the parasitic mind did so well.
Exactly. Yeah. So now I'm like, okay, now I incorporated, I'm going to pay my 20% corporate tax, which I dutifully paid because I need to fund all of the noble Gazans who will come to Canada to ensure that I now have to flee Canada. It's important for me to contribute through my taxes to my own demise and that of my children because I'm a good and kind person. So now once that's done, and I'm like, okay, guys, I've tried to contribute for 50 plus years to Canada. I'm out of here. Then my accountant says, whoa. What do you mean you're out of here? What do you mean you're out of here? You got to pay the departure tax. What do you mean departure tax? I paid all my taxes. No. We're going to look at all of your investments, and which you haven't sold. So they're unrealized. And the government's going to say, it's not fair if you now move to the United States for us not to get the cut that we would have gotten had you stayed in Canada and eventually sold those investments. So if you bought something for $1 and it's now worth $5, but you haven't sold it yet, so you've made $4 just in the books, we're going to tax you on those $4. And by the way, if later, when you do want to sell it, it's at a loss, the governments don't come back and say, oh shit, we taxed you when it was in gain, but now you ended up losing all your money. We don't give a shit. But that's not even what bothered me the most because I knew about that unrealized capital gains and I was emotionally ready for it. I was told that, hey, you have now a company, you've already paid all your corporate taxes, but if you now leave with whatever you've amassed in that company, we need to tax you on that. I said, but I've already paid my tax for that. Well, no, because if you decide later in life to take out money from that company, had you been in Canada, we would have taxed you. You're no longer in Canada, so pay upfront all the money, even though you didn't liquidate your company. That seems like a really fair system. And as I was told by many Canadians who sent me endless hate, I am a truly terrible person for not having given 50, 60, 70% of my worth and daring to complain about it on X. What a terrible Jewish ingrate I am.
More like a sensible person who's invoked what you say we all need to, the survival instinct. You're not going to survive. You're not going to thrive by constantly giving all your money over to the government. And the thing I didn't realize, and perhaps Ontario has it as well, is that Quebec has their own exit tax. So you've got two.
Yes.
It's utterly unreal. I understand why you've decided to go. Maybe you could comment on this last. We heard about the doctor leaving the Montreal Jewish General and going to Alabama. You're going to Mississippi. I've been talking to Michael Sachs, who was involved in Jewish affairs in Vancouver. He's moved to Tulsa, Oklahoma. All these places that Canadians would sneer at as not being as sophisticated. And here we've got Jews from Canada saying, you know what? I feel safer in Mississippi. I feel safer in Alabama. I'm going to do better with my family in these places. What do you say to those Canadians sneering, believing that they're so sophisticated, and where you're moving, well, yeah, it's Mississippi.
I'm so glad you asked this question, because the number of people in my progressive liberal neighborhood in Montreal who really, with astounding disdain, could not believe that someone like me, a sophisticated intellectual, number one, would move to the United States, which is just a hotbed of genocide. I mean, Jews are being lynched in every city of the United States. How would you even move to the United States? Never mind that Trump is in power, number one, but you're moving to Mississippi, right? So the level of imbecilic arrogance by the progressive Canadians might be even worse than the parasitic taxation, because you talk about you shouldn't stereotype, right? The same progressives would come down hard on you for wrongly stereotyping a group, but it is perfectly fine for them to stereotype others because, they have the progressive calculus on their side. Let me be very clear. One of the main reasons I decided to move to Ole Miss, despite the fact that I had many other universities that were courting me, is I got there and the love that I felt, the hospitality that I felt was so great that at an actual event, I jokingly said, I hereby declare everybody in the audience as honorary Lebanese, because I'm invoking there the fact that the Lebanese are very well known for their over-the-top generosity. So all of those Canadians that are scoffing at your neighbors down south who are, toothless hicks who sleep with their sisters, maybe look at the mirror before you start stereotyping others.
It's been great talking to you. Thanks so much for being generous with your time. Thank you for the book, and I do encourage everyone to order a copy, pick one up wherever you can. We'll talk soon.
Thank you, sir. Cheers.
Full Comment is a post-media podcast. My name's Brian Lilly, your host. This episode was produced by Andre Prue. Theme music by Bryce Hall. Kevin Libin is the executive producer. Make sure that you hit the subscribe button, share this on social media, and let your friends know about us. Thanks so much for listening. Until next time, I'm Brian Lilly.
Here's that clip from Canada Did What? Season 2 that we promised for you. Let me take you back to the night of October 30th, 1995. To the hours right after that likely fatal bullet was dodged. We're awaiting the reaction from the Quebec Premier at the time, Jacques Parizeau, who was championing separatism and had just narrowly lost the vote he had held to try and get it. Did I say narrowly? It was a razor-thin loss. 49.42% of voters said yes to Quebec independence. 50.58% said no. The difference was just above 0.5%, less than 55,000 votes out of nearly 5 million. Now, there's a generally accepted protocol for what a politician is supposed to do when they lose a vote. You come out, concede defeat, congratulate the victor, kiss your spouse, and thank your supporters. But every once in a while, a politician comes out and says what they really think. They just let it all out in front of news cameras. The bitterness, the disappointment, the recriminations, a no-filter tirade about how the voters are idiots and vowing revenge. That's what happened on the night that Parizeau lost the referendum for Quebec independence.
On va parler de nous. À 60%, on a voté pour.
If you don't speak French, that's Parizeau saying that although they lost the referendum, Quebec's French speakers voted 60% for independence. The implication being that if they simply ignored the non-French Quebecers, Those who weren't real Quebecers, that is, immigrants, Jews, Indigenous people, McGill University students, they would have won this referendum in a walk. If you want to hear the rest of the story, make sure you subscribe to Canada Did What? Everywhere you get your podcasts.